Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up today, struggling to reach a deal. COP27 negotiations will continue into the weekend. Weeks of rainfall in days across Britain as Australia is hit by flooding for the second time in a month. And environmental groups say the government's autumn statement has fallen woefully short of tackling climate change. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes to our world and interrogate some of the potential solutions to the climate crisis. Well, talks at COP27 in Egypt should have been finishing with an agreement this afternoon, but there's little sign of a deal at the moment. All the indications are that talks will continue into the weekend, and there are still huge differences between nations on how to tackle climate change. In a moment, we'll have the latest from the talks in Sharm el-Sheikh. But first, a reminder of what politicians and diplomats were hoping for at the start of the talks on November the 6th. So the Secretary-General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, this is what he said. At the beginning of COP27, I am calling for a historic pact between developed and emerging economies, a climate solidarity pact. This pact will be one in which all countries make an extra effort to reduce emissions this decade in line with the 1.5-degree goal. The two largest economies, the United States and China, have a particular responsibility to join efforts to make this pact a reality. Well, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, she focused on reparations for developing nations, saying there is no way that developing countries can fight this battle without access to concessional funding. We believe that it is critical we address the issue of loss and damage. How do companies make $200 billion in profits in the last 3 months and not expect to contribute at least 10 cents on every dollar to a loss and damage fund? This is what our people expect. Meanwhile, the environmental campaigner and former US Vice President Al Gore has said, "We have a credibility problem, all of us. We're talking and we're starting to act, but we're not doing enough. We must see the so-called dash for gas for what it really is, a dash down a bridge to nowhere, leaving the countries of the world facing climate chaos and billions in stranded assets, especially here in Africa. We have to move beyond the era of fossil fuel colonialism." Now, one possible breakthrough at the talks has been on the issue of compensation for poorer countries affected by climate change. This morning, as smaller nations insisted a deal had to be reached, the EU said it would be willing to contribute to a so-called loss and damage fund.
I have to say this is our final offer. This is where the member states can find an agreement, and I have to thank all of them for the courage to go this far, but this is it. This is about not having a failure here. We cannot afford to have a failure. Now, if our steps forward are not reciprocated, then obviously there will be a failure, but I hope we can avoid that.
These processes are difficult. When you're trying to create something new, it takes time. And what we have to measure is how willing all partners are in getting and overcome their difficulties. We are identifying the areas that we think need adjusting, and there is a process to do this. And I cannot get into those details. I cannot negotiate on the media. So we'll wait until we meet bilaterally to discuss the areas of concern.
All right, well, let's get the very latest from COP27. Tom Heap from The Climate Show is in Sharm el-Sheikh. Hi, Tom. So, Friday is coming to an end. Where are we with this agreement?
Still not there. The wire is being bent, is being stretched. We've definitely, very, very unlikely to get an agreement today. But as you say, I am here in this extraordinary hive of humanity, big, sprawling area of people trying to do their best to, if you like, save the world. But I am a bit of a new boy, a bit of a Johnny-come-lately, in comparison to Victoria Seabrook, our climate reporter. Victoria, you've been here for more than 14 days. You must be really, really immersed in it by now.
Yes, it does start to feel a bit like Groundhog Day once you've been here for a while, but thankfully things are really ramping up now as we get close to the finish, so the adrenaline gets you through towards the end.
Well, what are those things approaching the finish line? What are the things still under debate?
Yeah, so we've had movement on two key things that we really needed to see if there was going to be a good outcome here, really, and that's happened in the last 24 hours. So one of the key issues is what we've heard so much about here, which is about who pays for climate impacts, climate damages in vulnerable countries, things like the flooding in Pakistan.
Yeah. Because I heard just 24 hours ago, Antonio Guterres, boss of the UN, came and said, there was a breakdown of trust between the North and South of this, and we needed to stand and deliver. Great phrase. And there has been some movement since then.
Yes, that's right. He actually jetted straight from the G20. He'd already been here last week and decided to come back to try and give the talks a little bit of momentum. What's happened on that key issue is there's been a rift, really, up until yesterday, with, on the one hand, developing countries saying we need a fund to pay when climate disasters strike, and developed countries, on the other hand, saying, yes, OK, we acknowledge that there needs to be some funding, but we think that actually it should be much broader than just a fund. There's lots of other levers that we can pull. They were really at loggerheads up until about yesterday, and then yesterday evening, potentially there has been a big breakthrough. We'll see how it plays out. But essentially, the EU sort of offered to meet in the middle and said, yes, OK, we'll do a fund, but with two important tweaks.
And those tweaks, I gather, they're to do with who the money goes to, the most vulnerable, and making sure it reaches those really in need. That's one of them?
Yes, that's exactly it. So the existing idea had very sort of stiff lines: developed countries, developing countries, developed pay in, and the fund pays out for developing countries. And the EU's big issue with this was saying, well, that list is old, and that would see China classed as a developing country. Sure. We need to target it to the most vulnerable countries. So that's one of their suggestions.
And I gather another one was kind of broadening the scope of kind of who pays. So it's not just kind of the taxpayers of the rich North, but some other institutions or mechanisms as well.
Yes, that's exactly it. Innovative sources of finance, as we're hearing so much about. So it's not just countries paying into the pot of money, it's pulling other levers. So it's ideas that they've suggested is things like levies on frequent flyers, on shipping, on these very polluting, carbon-intensive industries, skimming money off those, fossil fuel production, and saying, let's use all these sources, not just countries paying in.
And the other thing I find really interesting about that is it's also not just looking at, if you like, historical guilt, in inverted commas. It's looking at what's actually emitting today, which I'm feeling might be a slightly easier sell to a lot of richer nations. But I wanted to move on as well. There's a lot that goes on here that isn't just about the top-level politicians and this final cover text, isn't there? And people are quite optimistic about that.
Yes, exactly. So you've got the pure process, the hardcore negotiations, diplomats, ministers, and so on. But you can think of it as like a centre of gravity around which we've got all of these other things circling. So a lot of what is achieved here is not just what happens behind closed doors in these dimly lit negotiating rooms in the wee hours. It's also big deals on offshore wind, on zero emission vehicles, all these other sectors that really need to get in line if we are going to curb warming.
Victoria, thank you very much indeed. So we shouldn't hang all of our hopes and fears on that final copy text, other things as well. Victoria, thank you very much, and back to you.
OK, Tom, thank you so much. Right, in other news today, the Met Office says that parts of the UK have seen 3 weeks' worth of rain in just 24 hours. There have been more downpours today, especially in eastern Scotland, where more than 80 millimetres of rainfall has been recorded in 2 days. And a warning after a mainly dry weekend, more rain is expected across the country early next week. For the second time in a month, parts of southeastern Australia have been hit by major flooding. Rural parts of New South Wales are said to be the worst affected after 3 days of torrential rain. Officials are warning the Lachlan River could reach a 70-year high of just under 11 metres for the second time in the last month. Regulators in the US have approved a $500 million plan to demolish 4 dams in California. It'll be the largest dam removal and river restoration project in the world, and it's something environmentalists and Native American tribes have long campaigned for. The aim is to reopen a large section of the Klamath River for the first time in more than a century, improving salmon stocks and increasing hydroelectric power. Isn't that beautiful? Now, the autumn statement provided a range of climate change announcements, including plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings by 15% within 10 years. But Friends of the Earth have said the government's plans fell woefully short. Well, Jess Ralston is from the non-profit group, the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, and she joins us now. So, Jess, thanks for joining us. Woefully short, but short of what? And do you agree?
Well, as far as we can tell so far, the autumn statement has a lot of measures in it talking about green things, but actually in the details, they're not actually delivering very much of that this year, next year, or the year after. It's mostly things from 2025 and beyond, which we're looking at. So for the immediate crisis that we're in right now, there's not all that much help for bill payers.
OK, he did say, though, the Chancellor, when he made that statement, that now would be the wrong time to step back from our international climate responsibilities. That does sound positive, regardless of whether it's now or 2 years down the line.
Yes, the government rhetoric on this is that they are committed to climate and committed to net zero, which is obviously positive considering that's what the Climate Change Committee think we need to do by 2050 in order to curb global warming. But there is still a lot to be done in this country. You know, our homes are very leaky, we waste a lot of energy. And during this current gas crisis, bill payers and taxpayers are looking to the government for leadership on those sorts of measures.
There is so much rhetoric, obviously, about insulating our homes. In that statement, the Chancellor promised an extra £6 billion to improve energy efficiency. Yes, again, by 2025, but that's a concrete step.
Well, it seems like it, but when you look at what's happening with the political polls, the Conservatives are, they're falling behind Labour on a lot of the polls, and almost all of them, I believe. So by the time 2025 comes around, there is a large question mark over whether Jeremy Hunt, Rishi Sunak, the Tories in general, whether they'll actually be in charge. So there's some people who are saying that these are easy promises when the situation in 2025 might be that they're not even in power.
Why do you think that they haven't committed to doing it from now?
I really don't know. And that's probably a question better posed to the government, because all of the experts, even fuel poverty groups, the CCC, everybody has been saying for years that it's a good idea to sort out our leaky homes. And given the current gas crisis, there's public demand for it as well. People want to do these things. People want to fix up their homes so they can save energy and save money on bills. But they're not being offered the kind of support that we're seeing in many other European countries. And it really is, a large question mark over why that's the case. Now, the BEIS Secretary, the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Secretary, is due to make another statement in the coming weeks around energy efficiency and around energy demand reduction. But so far, what we're seeing from the government is a lot of talking and not a lot of walking. So it might be that we see more in the coming weeks, but so far there's a large question mark.
OK. Concrete step, they did hike the windfall tax. Surely you must be pleased with that step.
Well, the windfall tax, lots of the public are thinking that that's a fair thing to do given the large profits that the oil and gas companies are making during the gas crisis. But when it comes to the renewable electricity generation tax, the renewables sector are a little bit baffled by this, because the oil and gas sector get taxpayer money back for investing in new oil and gas, whereas the renewable electricity generators don't get anything for investing in new renewable electricity. So there's a bit of a backward step there when quite clearly the solution to the gas crisis is moving away from gas and moving to more renewables. And this loophole for the oil and gas companies that's not present for the renewable generators, that's a bit of a thing where the businesses are saying, this doesn't make any sense considering you need us to invest in order to get to net zero. So there's questions again about the windfall tax, but one step they did take was to reduce that loophole. So instead of making 81p in the pound, they only make 29 or 30p. So they've reduced it, but there's still an incentive there to invest in new oil and gas. And that doesn't make much sense when we need to get away from it in order to get away from the gas crisis and to reach net zero.
OK. Jess, thank you so much for talking to us. And before we go, a reminder that Tom is going to be presenting a special climate show. He's, as you saw, in Sharm el-Sheikh this weekend, focusing on the end of COP27 and what, if anything, gets achieved. You can watch that show on Saturday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m. And the Daily Climate Show will be back on Monday at 3:30. Have a good weekend, and until then, goodbye.